think all we're missing is Peter Galatano. Would someone be able to just shoot him a quick text just to make sure he knows? And then meanwhile, we need to call the meeting to order. I believe that we need to do a roll call vote to open the meeting. So can I first get a motion to open the meeting in a second?
So moved.
Second.
All right, roll call vote for opening the meeting. Wasim Basili.
Aye.
Jane has stepped out, but we can probably still get a majority without her. Stephen Leahy.
Aye.
Mark Albers.
Aye.
Natalie Weir.
Aye.
Drew Kashal.
Aye.
Brendan Daly. Brendan. Brendan, can you hear us? I'll move on to Jane. Jane Matarazzo.
Are we just calling it to order? I missed what
Yeah.
we were.
Yes,
Aye.
this is just opening the meeting.
Okay,
Brent?
and Steve, if you still want me to take minutes, I just saw your message.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, sure.
Brendan, can you hear us? We have at least 8 voters to open the meeting. So it is 7:04 and the meeting is called to order. This is the Sherborn Advisory Committee. This is a public meeting of May 5th, 2021. And I'm going to begin with the reading of the agenda. So first is addition of topics not reasonably anticipated by the chair 48 hours in advance. I have nothing to add. Does anybody else from advisory have anything to add to the agenda? All right, hearing none. Moving on, follow-up items, reports from liaisons as needed. And then current meeting items, there's just one item, which is a discussion and possible revision and revote of the motion for the 2021 town meeting warrant Article 9, which is the Laurel Farm turf field.
I'll squeeze in. You okay? You sound stressed.
Yeah, I mean, I am.
All right. So, all right, Peter's here. Good. And Brendan still has this can't hear anything face. Can you hear us, Brendan?
I'm good now.
Okay, good. All right. So first off, I know that there's been sort of a lot of chatter in the upcoming, the past week about this meeting. I do want, for all the people who are here interested to see what's going on, I do want to point out that we are not reopening the public hearing. We are not here to take public comments and new information or comments about this article. Our goal is not to potentially reverse our vote or alter our recommendation to the town. Obviously, at the public hearing, we have already made our vote. We've already written and published and delivered our advisory report to the town. All it is that in the process of writing our motions for the town meeting, it became clear that the motion that was passed at the town meeting does not accomplish some of the things that this article is supposed to accomplish. And I sort of decided as the chair, and it's not unusual for advisory. I mean, there's always some editing of the motions and added legal language and whatnot prior to town meeting. But I decided that the amount of stuff we needed to change in this motion was large enough that it warranted having another public discussion with the rest of advisory and a revote to make sure that everybody who was in favor of the motion remains in favor of the amended language. So anybody who is showing up hoping that advisory is going to reverse course and vote not to take no action on this, you'll probably be disappointed. So that said, basically, there are two things that Jane and I felt were necessary in this motion that were not in the motion that was passed at the public hearing. Number one is that the article calls for the establishment of a stabilization fund into which certain amount of money would be put aside for the purpose of replacement and or repair of the field at the end of its lifespan, which is estimated at 8 to 10 years. So our motion completely neglected to establish that stabilization fund. So we want to add that language in.
Are you sure? Sorry. Are you sure? Did you re-listen to the hearing?
I think there was a mention of the stabilization fund, but the problem is that there wasn't any meat around it. So, and Steve, you might want to keep going because that was, we weren't sure how the dollars would get into that fund.
Yeah, so that was
mentioned.
Right. So one of the issues was that it was not clear whether the article states that the stabilization fund is to be funded by field fees and private donations, but the way that the revolving fund is set up, field fees are to go into the revolving fund. So it leaves open the question of, okay, well, now you have field fees, and so how do you distribute them into the revolving fund versus the stabilization fund? And I believe this was when we were discussing with town council at the motions meeting, all of the other stabilization funds in town, the way that they're set up is any money that goes into or comes out of the stabilization fund has to be approved at town meeting. So when you're putting money into a stabilization fund, you have to pass that amount at town meeting as a majority. And then if you're going to take money out of the stabilization fund, then that also needs to be passed at town meeting by a 2/3 majority. So we wanted to ensure that it was clear that this stabilization fund functions the same way.
Well, I don't think that was, sorry, Steve, I don't think that was the intent, right? Because you and I discussed this. And the wording that was in there was put in there by council, which basically left it open for us to automatically fund the stabilization fund directly from field fees. So we could take a percentage or some static amount of money from every lease, and it never have to hit the revolving fund at all and go directly into the stabilization fund. So that's why that wording was put in there, was specifically to not necessarily, to essentially automatically have it happen. We could obviously, at any point, if there was excess money in the revolving fund, we could move it over from there into the stabilization fund with a vote if we wanted to. But the thinking at the time, and again, it was suggested by council that we put that language in there, so it didn't restrict us from funding it automatically. So, I don't, ideally that's how it would happen, right? Because there's no reason for us to have the money in the revolving fund. It wouldn't commingle with any of our operational funds. So it would be very clear in terms of this was money that was set aside specifically for the replacement of the field down the road. And it wouldn't be at our discretion in terms of how much money moves over every year.
Well, conveniently, we have town council here. I requested that Amanda be here for this meeting. So I guess, are you able to clarify then in terms of how stabilization funds are set up in terms of can it work both ways? And you're muted right now, Amanda.
The mechanism of the stabilization fund is, as you say, is that if you're moving money in, it's a majority vote. If you're moving money out, it's a 2/3 majority vote. My thought was that this was a discussion. The discussion at the last meeting was focused on the first dollar out to pay debt service. So under Chapter 28 of your bylaws, the field fees do go into a revolving fund. It wasn't clear to me in the advisory committee meeting that you were trying to direct the funds, without going through that process of a vote.
Right, so the idea was, and again, this is specifically why the language was put in there, and we can have a chat about whether or not it's the right language or not. But the idea was, let's say we charge somebody $150 to use the fields. That let's say $50 of that money automatically gets put into the stabilization fund, and 150 of it, or sorry, and 100 of it would go into the revolving fund. And the idea being that it doesn't ever have to sit in our revolving fund. It could automatically feed directly into the stabilization fund.
Yeah, I'm gonna need to, is your treasurer, CFO here? I don't see her.
No, sorry, I did
So
not.
for the moment, Steve, just if we can set that aside, what was the second revision that you felt needed to be made?
Well, the way that the motion was written, it does not specify that the private money needs to be used before the public money is used, even though I know that that is the intent of the Recreation Commission. That's certainly the way that they have been presenting this project to everybody from the get-go. But the way that it's written, all it says is that the borrowing can only be triggered once $3 million has been raised, but it does not specify that the $3 million has to be spent before the $1 million. So it would leave open the possibility that after $3 million of private funding was raised, $1 million was borrowed by the town, and then the first dollar spent on the project was actually from that $1 million. So we wanted to add something that would basically require that the $3 million be spent prior to the town borrowed money.
And I'm not sure, I was thinking about this after our conversation, because I'm not really sure how, like the mechanism for ensuring that, right? Because the 3 million will be gifted to the town and it will go into some fund to be spent. And then the money that's borrowed from the town will go presumably into the same fund, right? So now you've got all the money commingled at that point, right? There's no distinction between the money that was privately raised and the money that came from the town. So it's confusing as to how we would limit the spending of the 3 million prior to the spending of the 1 million. I think more the point, it's more around when does the million from the town get borrowed? So when do we trigger the actual bond to be utilized? And the timing of that is I mean, again, I don't know that that's possible to know, because at some point in the project you're going to trigger certain certain payouts of certain expenses. And so I talked to Heidi about this extensively, which is obviously we want to borrow that money as late as possible because we know that we'll be paying interest on it. So we don't want to borrow it up front, right? Because there's no point in if we got 3 million in the bank of paying interest on money you're not using yet. But at the same time, we don't want to borrow it too late, because she needs I think she said about 60 days in order to actually go through the process of getting the money. So somewhere in that beginning of the project to 60 days before you need it, we have to go to the town and say, we anticipate we're going to be borrowing the money because we're at this phase of the project, or because we expected this is the money that has to be paid out. So
do you have an estimate for how long the project would take in total, from the first dollar needing to be spent to the finish of project?
I would expect it would be a few months.
Yeah.
So, but that's for the field. I don't know with the parking improvements and everything exactly how long it would all take, whether or not the parking improvements would be in parallel to the field itself. But I think that's TBD.
And then the first dollars spent presumably are actually going to be on the design and the engineering plans for the project, right?
Correct. Correct.
And I think that's where we hit our first potential kind of like hurdle, right? Is that, okay, you get this plan, now you're going to have to bring that plan to, potentially one or more additional boards in town for approval. And I
Correct.
think that's the step in the process where we want to ensure that we haven't already borrowed $1 million, right? And that we're paying interest on something that might be stuck going back to the drawing board and altering things, or whatever, right? So that's I think that's why
Yeah, we'll still have to raise 3 million. I mean, the goal would be to raise the 100 to 150 to get the plan done and then get that completed and submitted. I don't expect we're going to even have the 3 million by the time the plan gets submitted to the town. There'll still be fundraising going on at that point.
Okay.
So I appreciate what you're trying to do, and I totally get it. As I was kind of mulling it over in my head, I'm like, I don't know how we get the mechanics in there without, creating something that's really convoluted and hard to interpret.
Right.
Yeah,
To your point- oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
oh, thank you. No, all I was going to say, the way that the article is written, it contemplates that there's going to be a $3 million deposit of private funds into an account with the town, not that up to $3 million of funds are going to be spent in order to pay contractors directly to do the design and engineering and permit applications and so forth.
Yeah, no. So it's only, all of the planning costs is I suppose it's kind of included in that 3 million, but it essentially would be like 2.9 on top of that would be raised. That would essentially trigger the availability of the other million. But the intent isn't that the 3 million goes towards the planning, right? It shouldn't cost anywhere close to that.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, I think there were two other issues that had come up during the motions meeting, and one of them I think is directly related to what we're talking about now, which was, basically when would the money be borrowed? But one question was clarifying that the money would not be borrowed until whatever regulatory approvals needed to be obtained had been obtained. In other words, so that the town wouldn't borrow the money and then find, in the event that one of the boards that has regulatory, discretion over this were to determine that the project couldn't go forward, then the money would have been borrowed for no reason. So one of the clarifications was, to make sure that the regulatory approvals were in order before the borrowing would happen. And I think that's sort of relevant to this, right? Because if the borrowing doesn't even happen until the regulatory approvals are in hand, then by definition, it would have to be private money that would be spent on the plans and so forth that would be submitted to the regulatory authorities.
Yeah, but what are you trying to prevent there? Because let's say it plays out the way you say it, which is that we raise the 3 million and we still don't have approval from the regulatory authorities. And then it triggers the $1 million from the town. So now we have 4 million in the bank that we can't spend on anything. What do you like?
That was the thing. We don't want to borrow.
We can't spend on anything anyway. So
yeah,
if we have to pay it back, we just pay it back to the town. We have 4 million in the bank and we owe $1 million. Like, you have the $1 million to pay the town back. There's no risk to the town.
I mean, there's, presumably it's a small period of time, but maybe it's not. Maybe that was part of what we were talking about, right? So you don't want, even if it's, if it takes, who knows how long regulatory approvals will take, but that's still debt service during that time period if the money's sitting there.
Sure. There's 3 million in the bank. So it's all, it's on us. We'll have to pay the debt service, but the town's at no risk.
Well, but that's why we thought it needed to be clarified, because that's not necessarily the case unless we clarify that that's what would happen, right?
Well, I understand what you're trying to prevent.
We don't want to borrow the money until it's time to really use it, right? So why would you borrow if you didn't have regulatory approval in hand first?
The two are not really related, right? Whether or not there's no risk to the town if we borrow the money. right? Because there's another 3 million in the bank. So adding an additional provisions around when the money is available doesn't get you anything, because there's no risk. You're not trying to prevent anything from happening, because what's the worst that happens is we have to pay debt service for 6 more months while we get the regulatory approval. We wouldn't do that anyway. It would be foolish, right? But trying to add language around it to prevent something that has such a tiny, like there really is, where there's zero risk, doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense.
There is a risk, David, to the full faith and credit of the town going out and borrowing money. The debt market doesn't care what we borrow it. Well, they do care what we borrow it for, but we are putting ourselves out there as a municipality to raise that money in the debt market for the benefit of the town.
Sure.
So from your perspective, I see what you're saying is that, yeah, there's 3 million over here, and when we get it, we'll pay it. And it makes perfect sense to you. From a municipal financing perspective, there is certain steps and procedures we have to go through, and we want to maximize the borrowing capacity for everyone's benefit. And the more clarification there is prior to voting on it, the much smoother the process will be to handle any hiccups, any unforeseen events, which I think is what Steve was in the motion process, we're trying to anticipate. So I get your point. It seems no risk, but there are risks when you access the debt market because our credit rating's on the line.
Sure, but
And
that's what
we
the
are-
town is. But that's what the town is voting on, to increase, to borrow the money, right? There's that exact outcome is what the town is voting on, which is to basically take on the debt, right? And it has the exact implications that you're talking about. That's precisely what the vote is about.
And we're adding clarifying language to make the process smoother, and so that well into the future, anyone reading the minutes of the town warrant or the vote will clearly see the intent that all parties were traveling down that road. And so, yes, it may be no risk. It may be a risk of going to the debt market, but it's clearly spelled out, and it's well paved. I think that's the point we're trying to make tonight.
Yeah, so I mean, there's
May
a
I-
question of clarity versus confusion, right? I mean, the more language we put in there, the more language we add around caveats, and when this happens, actually, as it is, it's fairly confusing. I don't think it adds clarity. And I don't I get it if we're trying to mitigate risk, but I don't see any risk that's being mitigated, right? The town isn't on the hook for the debt service. We'll have $3 million in the bank to pay the debt service. The town, in terms of increasing the borrowing of the town, that's precisely what we're voting on. So I don't understand what the risk is, but I do understand where the confusion can come from, because we're adding more to to the actual motion.
I mean, to be honest, Dave, I would think you would want this, and I would think it would benefit your position, because if the town is comforted that, that the money's not going to get borrowed if the project isn't happening, I mean, that could only be a good thing, right? If you don't have to worry about that possibility or that risk, then it's one less thing to worry about in deciding how to vote.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I understand where you're coming from. I'm concerned more that there's the actual motion will end up being too confusing for people to understand what's going on. I think that it's very easy to explain that we don't want to borrow the money, that the debt service is not something we want to take on. We want to delay borrowing the money from the town as long as we possibly can, because there's debt service. I think that is logical, but tying it to all the approvals of all of the relative committees and saying it has to be spent in a certain order, I think it actually creates a whole bunch of confusion later on in terms of when we decide what's been spent and who's provided approval. The town's voting for the $1 million, right? It's
Right.
either they agree that, we'll be responsible and we'll spend it with, with the best interest of the town, or they won't vote for the $1 million.
So can I jump in? Because Dave, I agree with everything you've said. I think this is unnecessary. This is not going to be simplifying in town meeting. And at the end of the day, I don't believe we take these steps, for other routine borrowing. We don't need to hedge against this. This is an authorization. It's not a mandate or an order. I feel like the motion was fine as it was written, and so I'm not going to support any change at this time.
May I chime in too? I would follow in what Drew mentioned. And I would also just ask if and when the borrowing is only going to happen once the $3 million is in place, is there a way in this potential borrowing that the $3 million is kind of held in escrow in some manner or on the balance sheets of the town, such that you've got effectively a triple collateralized loan, which, Peter, while you brought up some good points about potential credit risk to the town, triple collateralized lending assuages lenders as well.
I don't know how to respond to that.
I guess it's not really a question for you, Dave. I guess the question
Yeah.
would really be for the $3 million that is raised. So first of all, I want to echo Drew's comments that I don't believe this language is necessary. But secondly, reverting back to some of the comments that Peter made about potential adding credit risk to the town and this borrowing, I don't fully understand the mechanism of who would be in charge of and who would have formal ownership or control of the $3 million that is privately raised at first. But I guess I was wondering, and maybe no one on this call can answer this, would those funds be put in a place in a way such that those are considered collateral for the loan, or no, there still just be a general obligation of the town, the $1 million?
So do you know, Dave, like as you raise money, where's the money going?
And I know Dave Williams has his hand up because we've talked about this in the past. And I believe that the way that there are a number of different methods, but one is that the money is gifted to the town and the select board votes to receive it for the use of this particular project. And then I don't know the method, like I don't know where it sits at that point. But presumably it it's under rec for us to then go off and do the project. Go ahead. Yeah. So,
Dave, can you
I don't know
clarify?
if David wants to comment on it.
I just wanted to say that I haven't seen this level of detail lately in any sort of other project, nor have I seen something like this in the past, because there's a lot of the things you're talking about are basically the job of the treasurer when they're balancing what to borrow and how to borrow. And for example, if there is something that says that all 3 million need to be spent, there's some sort of overlap area of paying that you could end up the treasurer in violation of the law because it's so tight. And there would be no way around that except addressing the wording. So that's a worst case scenario in making it that tight. But it is expected of the treasurer that their job is to maximize other funds first before town funds. And if they understand that was the vote of the town, they're especially going to follow that. But we would never use town funds first when there are available funds sitting out there from another entity. And what I was going to say is that with the money being raised, it can be raised by setting up a 501c3 on the outside as a nonprofit, and the nonprofit donates to, periodically into the town, and the treasurer deposits it into its own account so that the interest is credited with those contributions. And another way of doing it is, and this is if the finance team supported this, is individuals would actually cut the check to the town, because the town is basically a nonprofit that's tax exempt. So people could make their contribution directly to the town, and then they would get basically a receipt for that contribution, and it would go into a gifts account that's that Heidi would invest, and at some point would make its way over to a stabilization fund for their use. So there are a lot of mechanisms. My fear is, without talking to the people that actually will be managing this money, buttoning it up and tightening it up makes me more anxious. That I would just rather wait to address than do something that's counterproductive. And I know you guys feel the same way, but I don't want to babble about it, but maybe by next week I can have some more conversations with Heidi. But I would like, if you are going to have some sort of change in the motion, that we have that as a proposed, and can be able to circulate it and review it with, I could get it out to the board or whomever else that I would want to get comments from. So that's all I ask, is whatever language you do come up with, but I get an opportunity to talk to the people that are involved, just to make sure that it's not too tight, because if it is, we're not going to have time to reconcile it before town meeting, and it would be better to shelve it than to move forward with it if it is making people uncomfortable on both sides. So that's all I had, Steve. Sorry.
All right, thank you, David.
And David, I think that it would be helpful too to bring in Heidi to talk about the mechanics of the revolving fund taking in the field fees and the creation of the stabilization fund. Because if the stabilization fund is not the proper mechanism to make the deposit for the private funds, then that clarity should be, we should get that clarity in the next couple of days.
Well, typically when we're taking in gifts, it's going to be either coming in from a 501c3 who has collected it, for example, in the example of the library, and it goes into a gifts account and waits there to be expended. But if the article would have to direct Heidi to be depositing into a stabilization fund.
No, I think, Amanda, you're talking about the fund to be used to replace or repair the field down the road, correct?
Right, and that is
which is separate from the money used to build the field.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I did have a conversation with Heidi about the proper account, and she did say to me that it should be a stabilization fund. Now, I obviously feel free to verify that. Certainly don't take my word for it, because maybe there's some subtleties that I wasn't able to explain or what have you, but we did actually have the conversation, and she said that was the right vehicle.
No,
for the ongoing maintenance, yes,
Yeah.
that would be the right vehicle, because it's one of the few accounts that can be carried forward year to year. So that's what you want, is the balance to be building and carried forward.
Yes, I just need her help on the clarification about the field fees, which are already by general bylaw moving into the revolving fund, to just make sure that there's no hiccup there.
Well, we could, I mean, so
That
one
would-
of the things, one of the ideas was to charge, if somebody were to lease the field, there's two different charges. One being a field leasing fee and one being a field replacement fee. And they show up as different items on their invoice.
Mhm.
And the field leasing fee gets sent into the general fund, the revolving fund, and the field replacement fee gets fed directly into the, the stabilization fund. So they're
I
not,
see.
so it's very clear that, when somebody goes to lease the field, which fee, which amount goes into which bucket.
I see.
Dave, is that in your internal accounting or is that through the town system?
The method has not been established yet. So
Okay.
the whole point was just to get the stabilization fund set up with the
Right.
ability to fund it directly. And again, that's why that language was put in there. And then we could figure out exactly, either through the, our invoicing or whether or not it comes into the, some town fund and then gets split out. I don't know the method, the mechanism internally that we would count for it, but right
Yeah.
now I think we're just trying to set everything up properly so we can do it in the future.
Yeah, I just didn't want to create more transactions than it needed to go into an account that's under the control of rec and rec informing us how much they want transferred over.
Yeah. No,
That's a
actually,
little-
that's exactly what I'm trying to avoid is I'm trying to make it as automatic and as sort of set it and forget it as possible. Just
Okay.
once the method is set up, then we don't even have to worry about anything from that point on.
Okay.
So Amanda, do you know, is that a legally allowable way to, feed into a stabilization fund to have certain fees automatically go into it? Or do stabilization funds always require a town meeting vote in order to put money into them?
It's a good question that I wasn't prepared to answer tonight, but I would like to talk to Heidi tomorrow morning to see if we can do that. Because if that mechanism is permissible, as long as it's clear and, it's sort of an added fee, then I think the proposal would work. But again, not prepared to answer it tonight.
I think you should assume that it needs a vote to be deposited into a stabilization fund, or there needs to be some sort of direction voted to touch a stabilization fund like that. We know it takes a vote to get it out, but in the past, other stabilization accounts we've set up, they have been voted
Well, I think
on.
that's why the language was put into the motion, right?
Exactly.
Because you don't want to vote on every $50 that gets put in there, right? So if it's possible, to Steve's question, which is like, if that's even legal, obviously we want to know it. And then hopefully the language we have in the motion allows us to do it.
Yes, right. That's where I would like to see it handled, that the authorization is there, because if it's not there, I don't think she can make transfers into it.
And then I guess for me, it raises the question that if it is legal to have a certain amount of fees go directly into the stabilization fund, how and when and who is going to decide what that breakdown is of how much goes into the stabilization and how much goes into the revolving funds? Because I know I can appreciate that you're like, oh, you want to set it and forget it. Or, well, how do you set it? When do you set it? And who is setting it?
If it's not specified in the article, then it would be under the commissioner's direction of how they want the funds allocated or split. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that to me, that raises the reason why my preference, at least at the beginning, it would be for it to all go into the revolving fund. And then at the end of the year, Rec Commission can say, all right, well, this is the amount that we sort of have left over that we want to put into the stabilization fund. Because if ultimately the Rec Commission is making that decision anyways, then I would rather have them making that decision at the end of the fiscal year when they've seen how the fund has done and how much is left over to go into the stabilization fund, which is, it's kind of the way that most of the other stabilization funds in town work, right? So
Yeah, with too.
And if it becomes clear a few years down the line that, okay, this is the steady state of the revenues and what the amount that should be going into the stabilization fund, and we determine that it is okay to alter the way that the stabilization fund works, then we can just do another article at a future town meeting to change it at that point. But from the get-go, we have really no idea how this is going to go. So I would rather have all the money go into one place first, and then we redistribute it from there.
Yeah, and I
I think
think
that's-
we're saying the same thing, because I think that the first year or two, we would have a, field replacement fee of $0 or $1 or something along those lines, because we, to your point, we don't know exactly what percentage of the overall field fees need to be diverted. To David's point, if we have the discretion to alter that down the line, then we can move it from $0 to $25 or $35 once we know what the right amount is, to make sure that we're getting the right amount into the fund. But again, I mean, I think the presumption is that it's allowable, right? If it's not allowable, I think in the end, we end up in the same place. I think it's really just a question of, does that mechanism even work? And do we do it now? Or do we do it later?
Yeah.
Well, the
I guess
mechanism, if I can just add some insight here, we're talking stabilization fund for field replacement once the field becomes revenue producing. So this is well after fundraising, well after construction and use of field. It's generating revenue. Where do we split that revenue? And so that's kind of where we've been going recently. And it makes sense that once we figure out, with Heidi's help and town council on the legal aspects, what the mechanism to hold those funds and transfer those funds into the holding stabilization fund for X number of years before the field has to be replaced, seems to be pretty straightforward once we get all that input in from the mechanism, the type of accounts, who does it, when they do it, has the authority, Recreation Commission, and then town vote or non-town vote. That's when the field is fully operational. We started on raising the money, and then when does the debt kick in, which is prior to revenue producing field operations. And I'm not sure if we're ready to go back in time to tackle that piece, but it does sound like there's some inputs from parties that aren't here in terms of the holding repository for the funds once it's producing revenue, to fund the stabilization for replacement in 8 or 10 years. And then going back to where we are now at the advent of fundraising and the incurrence of town debt and some of the issues that came up during the warrant article crafting.
So Peter, what would you recommend right now in terms of us setting up the stabilization fund as to the mechanism of input into the stabilization fund?
Well, I like listening to all input with the town vote and stabilization funds to have it. It makes sense to have it all go into the revolving fund, knowing that the guidelines set by Recreation was to fully fund over the course of the life of the original field, those funds to replace the existing field in 8 to 10 years. And it could be a gradual ramp up given how much funds are in the revolving fund each year. They come to town meeting, they come to advisory town meeting and say, we have maybe a portion, a smaller portion, year 1, year 2, And then as the full use and utilization of the fields increase in years 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that a larger amount could be shifted over to cover the full cost of replacement up in year 10, 8, 9, or 10. And that way the town has the ability to vote because there's a pot of money set aside. 100,000, I think was the number thrown about at the meetings each year because it's sitting in the revolving fund untouched, earmarked for the stabilization fund. Come to advisory, come to all annual town meetings saying we seek a vote to transfer into the stabilization fund this sum of money because it is excess beyond earnings and reinvestment and operations to replace the field via the means of the stabilization fund. That is just a back of the envelope path that seemed to come from our discussion now.
All right, thanks. Jeff Waldron, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to say, we created a stabilization fund for OPEB, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. There's people on the call that may remember it. I believe the town has to vote to create a stabilization fund, and they have to vote, as Amanda said, by 2/3 to remove funds from a stabilization fund, which we did with the general stabilization fund 2 years ago for the tree work. We took $150,000 out. I think you could add money to a stabilization fund without a vote. So that could be confirmed. My only other suggestion, when you talk to Heidi, I think she'll do this anyway. In addition to Petrini and Amanda, I think you should ask for an opinion from bond counsel also, just so that we have a separate bond counsel and they would then, even if we don't necessarily need their opinion, it makes them aware of what we're considering doing and what the mechanisms are so that the bond that's the $1 million bond that's eventually borrowed, that they understand how the whole process is going to work. So Heidi does that regularly. Thank you.
Thanks. And I can appreciate the sentiment that generally speaking, with large capital projects in town, we do not have this level of detail in the language. But part of that is because generally speaking, with large capital, it's being 100% paid by the town, right? This is a public-private sort of cooperative enterprise, which is not typically how things happen. And the most recent time that has happened has basically been the library. And so that looms large over this. And I think that some of the issues with that project have been due to the fact that language was not detailed enough and was not ironclad enough at the motions that were passed. So this is one of the reasons why we have been, I think, sort of picking this one apart to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and that precisely what the town is expecting or wants to happen, that is all laid out very clearly, and that it isn't just a matter of, well, let's trust that certain people are responsible and have the best interest of the town, and that the treasurer has leeway to make a decision this way or that. And personally, I do trust that you all have the best interests of the town, and I do trust that Heidi is going to make decisions in that manner. But I think that part of the responsibility of the advisory committee is to ensure that where language can be added to protect the town's interests, that we discuss it and vote, and if we decide that we recommend the town adopt certain language, right? So I think that's the reason why. I mean, obviously there are a lot of opinions on this, and so this is the reason why I wanted to make sure that we had this discussion with full advisory in a public meeting.
Unfortunately, we don't have the people that we need on the call, so we're kind of just wasting time tonight. Do we need to call another meeting next week with Heidi and try to get it done before the meeting?
No.
Can I say something, Stephen?
Yeah.
With a stabilization fund, you have to have a 2/3 vote to create it. You have to have a 2/3 vote to expend from it. You just need a majority vote to deposit into that fund. But it does need a vote at some point. So if you wanted Heidi to have the authority to make that deposit based on what the commissioners want transferred in each year, the article is going to have to give that authority now, or the commissioners are going to have to bring an article forward each year authorizing X amount to transfer into the stabilization fund and have it voted every year. I mean, that's how I've done it.
I want to make clear there are sort of like two elements of this motion that we're discussing, and I think we are hopping back and forth on them. So one is first in terms of the borrowing, whether there is any provisions on the timing of the borrowing and the use of that money. And then the second is the stabilization fund and the mechanisms by which it is by which money is transferred into it. So those are two separate issues. And what I'd like to do, I think, is go around and kind of do a quick straw poll of the advisory members to sort of see, okay, do you feel that it is necessary to add anything to the motion on the first count, which is the provisions on the borrowing and the timing of the spending? And then number two, on the stabilization fund, it needs to be established whether you have a feeling, I would say whether you have an objection to establishing it as the money transfers from the revolving fund into the stabilization fund. So I'd like to get a feeling from, because if a majority of people on advisory here feel that both of these changes are unnecessary, then yes, I think we are wasting our time and we don't really need to do anything more. But if we have enough people who think that a change is necessary, then we do need to make the revision and do the vote tonight. So sort of, this is kind of in order of where you are on my screen right now. So Wasim, do you have thoughts on those two issues? One, whether it's necessary to add provisions on the borrowing and spending of money for the project itself, and then the stabilization fund, whether you have an objection to it being funded from the recreation revolving fund initially.
Yeah, so on the first question, to be honest, if there's a revision I'd like to see is that all the money is raised privately, but in terms of adding a provision that about the timing, that will probably create I'm worried it will create more problems than help. So that's my worry on that provision. I don't fully understand, what the consequences of such provision are. So, but my worry is that if you enforce some timing with the borrowing, yeah, I'm worried it'll cause some issues. On the other one, which is the creating the stabilization fund, the moving money into the stabilization fund. To Peter's point, this is after the field is up and running and operational, and we're making money on it. I mean, I've seen so many articles where they are voted on, they pass, and then we make an amendment, let's say to add another stabilization fund or something else. I just feel that is way down the road, that whether we amend the article now or whether a year from now we realize that we need to amend it. I mean, that's something I feel can be done down the road. It's probably, I mean, I don't know how long this project is going to take, but it's not going to be, in less than a year.
All right, Jane. You're muted.
Sorry about that. I think the more clarity we have in our motion, the better, so that people know exactly what they're voting on. So I think having a very clear motion as to how this money, I think, you know, your point about the library was a good one, Steve. I think people, you know, may have their antenna up if we don't have clarity. And so that's why I would prefer to see clarity in the motion. And as far as the establishment of the stabilization fund is concerned, I actually have a question for Amanda on that, because I thought at the motions meeting, Amanda, you may have mentioned that because it was in the warrant article, we had to mention the stabilization. We had to say something about stabilization. Do I recall that correctly?
I believe that was a comment from a member of the advisory committee that the motion had originally neglected to mention the stabilization account. I don't have Article 9 in front of me.
I think what it is that the warrant article language specifically says that, you know, one of the questions is whether to establish a stabilization fund. So,
right, and as I
think
recall, the original motion did not include that.
We had two separate articles in the beginning, and then council reviewed it and then recommended that one article go forward and the other one be put on hold. The other one that was on hold was the stabilization fund being created and funded to maybe be brought to a special town meeting in the fall for it to be created and funded, or even next year in the spring. And then the commissioners, I think, talked to council about combining it all and getting it done in one article. And that's what I remember.
Yeah, and that's what we ended up doing. Both the stabilization fund and the borrowing are in the same article. I think and again, I didn't go back and listen to the last meeting, but I think just based on what you said, Steve, there was just a discrepancy in terms of what was said versus what was written. Correct?
Yes.
I mean, Brendan, I think you are correct that there was a mention. I mean, you made the motion, so you know what you said, right? Yeah, it's mentioned. Stabilization's mentioned.
Yeah, and so this question came up a few weeks ago, and I looked at my notes and I wrote it down because I didn't want to flub it. And I definitely mentioned the raising the $3 million first. You know, that the borrowing was contingent upon that, and I mentioned the stabilization fund. So, you know, it's in there. Whether or not, you know, I don't really, for the purposes of the vote, I don't care whether there's a $15 fee every time the field is rented or whatever, how we do the accounting. I would see this working like any other stabilization fund. So like OPEB, every year we say we'll put $100,000 in OPEB, we vote in a town meeting, and then 10 years later, you say we need $1 million to replace the field, and we vote on that. So I'm sorry, while I'm on, I think the language is fine. I don't think that we need to make any changes. You know, I think that about the timing of when the money is spent, the money is fungible. So the $1 million borrowed is no different than the $3 million that we raise once you put it in the fund, right? So once it's in the account, it's all the same. So I think it's good as it is, and I think we can move
on. Okay. Let's see, Steve Leahy, what are your thoughts on provisions on the borrowing and timing of spending, and also stabilization fund? Do you have an objection to its being fed by the revolving fund?
I don't. I'll actually mimic exactly what Brendan just said. I feel that we do not need to put in any additional language on the first part of this, or the first question you were asking. And similarly to the other stabilization funds that we have every year, we vote to put money into it, and then with the goal that 10 years from now, and someone keeping track of this, that 10 years from now, we vote to spend it to rehab the fields.
Great. Mark Albers, what are your thoughts on the two issues at hand?
Yeah, I fall right where what was Steve just said. No need to revise the language. And I don't have a strong opinion on the stabilization fund. I guess I just have no objection to it.
Okay. Natalie, where do you
I
hear?
guess I agree with Mark Albers, what he just said.
Okay. Drew?
Yeah, I don't support any changes.
And you're okay with the stabilization fund being fed by the revolving fund?
I think that we'll have another bite at that apple, frankly, before
Yeah.
it gets zero.
Yep. And then Peter?
I think the tranche or the spending should be segregated or at least graduated in terms of private funding first before town funding. And if that's already there, then I'm there. To add clarity that private funds are first, and if all funds are raised privately, then there's no need for public funding. And so if we can hard code that in the article, that should send a clear message to all town voters on whose money is being used first before the town money. And that's one thing on the first section. The up and running operations and funding stabilization funds, yes, we can kick that can down the road. Once the fields are done, special town meeting, even the next all-town annual town meeting, when we have a better sense of the full operation or partial year operation of the fields, the recreation department and the committee will have a better sense of what funds are available as they ramp up or fully meet the amortization of replacement of that field. So that one can be postponed. But I think the initial language should clarify the priority of spending.
All right, so even without my vote, there are 6 people who clearly are not in support of any changes to the motion, or rather any addition of provisions. So I don't believe that we need to discuss that or draft anything or vote on it. And then with the stabilization fund, there were no objections to it being at least initially fed by the revolving fund, and there is always the possibility that at a future town meeting we could alter that. I guess I would just want to know, David and Gavin, you're both here. Do you have any specific objections to that, having your stabilization fund being fed initially by the revolving fund? At least objections to the degree that if we pass this motion in this way, that I do not want you to immediately stand up at town meeting and say, I want to amend this right now on the floor before you all vote on it, because I'm trying to make town meeting go as smooth as possible.
Look, I think you can do both. But in the end, it's the same thing. I mean, my only concern is that it's sitting in the revolving fund, and that's like, that's our main checking account, right? And so ideally, if we can not have it sit there and there's no possibility for it to be confused with our operational funds, then that's what I'm striving for.
Right.
However, again, as I said earlier, we end up in the same place if that's the sort of the thoughts from advisory, that's what you guys want to, the direction you guys want to go, then I'm okay with that.
All right, because I do believe that that is the direction we want to go, at least initially, because we don't know exactly how the money is going to flow and how much it's going to come through. I mean, again, it's like you said, it's like you want a separate account, money goes in there, you don't touch it. But we're just saying, just have one account to start with, have a little bit of self-control. And I mean, ultimately, at the beginning,
no, I
for
get
a
it.
few years, you have to spend the money that you need to spend to keep the recreation programs going, right?
Yeah.
And you'll find out how much is left over after a couple of years of that. Right?
No,
So,
I don't have an objection to it. Like I said, I
Right.
was trying to make things easier for us later, but we can, to Drew's point, we get another bite of that apple later.
Okay. So then I think that actually we probably don't need to make any votes on this motion. I think that the motion as we have drafted, and Amanda, this is the motion that you should have in hand right now. Basically, it states everything that I think a majority of advisory supports tonight, which is there's, the borrowing happens after 3 million is raised. There are no additional provisions. We establish a stabilization fund, and it is funded by the Recreation Revolving Fund. So I think that's where we're at. Does anybody else from advisory have any comments or questions?
I had a question, Steve. I thought at the motions meeting, there had been some discussion about debt service getting, debt service being paid with the funds. And I don't, we don't have it on the screen, so I don't know where we ended up with the motion, but I don't recall whether that was in the public hearing and whether it's in the current motion.
Can you all see that? So this is the motion as it is right now. And we do have at the very end, we did say that the field fees will be applied to debt service first. Which I assume, Dave and Gavin, that you don't have an issue with that, since I think your whole plan is predicated on paying the debt for service first.
Yeah, absolutely. Where does it say that? I just don't see it.
It's the very last line. Provided, however, that field fees shall be first applied to debt service for said borrowing.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. All it's saying is that, all right, the money's going to go into the revolving fund first. You guys decide how much goes in the stabilization fund, but you just have to make sure that you pay the debt service before you start putting money aside in the stabilization fund.
And I'm assuming like it's implied that that's whatever the yearly or monthly debt service is, right? It's not
Correct.
the entire amount.
No. Yeah, it's just whatever it is for that year.
Okay.
So what I'm gathering from our discussion with advisory tonight is that everybody on advisory should be okay with the way that this motion is currently drafted. So if you're not okay with that, please speak up now or forever hold your peace, because otherwise this is the motion that is going to be read out at town meeting. All right, so if there are no other comments or questions, then I would like to ask for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Second.
All right, roll call vote. Wasim Basili. Jane Matarazzo.
Aye.
Steve Leahy.
Aye.
Mark Albers.
Aye.
Natalie Weir.
Aye.
Drew Kashout.
Aye.
Brendan Daly.
Aye.
Peter Galatano.
Aye.
And I'm also an aye. It's 8:12 and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.
Your
At
time.
all.
Much
Ciao, guys.
Mm.